school. I hated it to the core of my being. But there was other things going on with me existentially, so Lisa had taken those classes and recommended, go down. It's good to just move the mind a bit and get the mind, sort of active, because we were in a state of total stasis. And I was so desperate, to think, and just move the mind and just get out of the rut. I actually did go down to this college and signed on for the class. And in its own sense, it was one of the most important things I ever did, Really important. But they didn't cover Heidegger in that course at all. It was just a, beginning.
Was it more sort of analytic?
Yeah, they covered almost all the, the major philosophers people would know about, like Plato, Aristotle, and Descartes, of course, and Hume, and Kant, and Nietzsche played a big role, things like that, moving up to like modern people like Peter Singer. And the next year I took pretty much the identical class. And it was through discovering all of the flaws, in an extremely rudimentary way. First of all, I'm not a degreed philosopher or even an expert in a subject by any strength of the imagination. My work is entirely syncretic. But through talking with colleagues and then reading subsequently on the subject in America, it became quite obvious even to me, with what little knowledge I had, that a lot of these analytical philosophers, they were like talking up a gum tree. A lot of it was just completely not making sense. But philosophy has this tremendous aura of untouchability, and these are the highest intellects in some sort of, Star Trek thing where there's voices in the clouds, they're all seeing, all powerful minds. And of course, again, in academia, this is very much emphasized. But yet the sort of spirit of individualism within me was, had enough guts to say, no, this doesn't make sense. And especially with people like Descartes, who are champions not just in a philosophical context, but their theories have permeated down into politics and all other sorts of areas of life. The treatment of animals, the man against the machine, and then more important ideas of like the collective versus the individual. These kinds of things.
And the dualism of mind and body.
Yes, very much so.
Separation of that.
Yeah. And in many ways, it's more than just a dualism. Because in Descartes, if you really read Descartes, he had already subdivided body from mind, which is the obvious one, but then world and God as well. There's like, once you've started one form of dualism, it just continues in this hideous inverted tree, And then they set about trying to reconcile all of these, disparate, aspects of their philosophy. And it almost is, okay, wait a minute here, am I getting this wrong? But did you already artificially create these divisions? And then you go through this elaborate process of trying to glue them back together like some kid playing with a jigsaw or a broken toy. Is that really philosophy? And so finally, when I start reading Heidegger, he was asking these same questions. It took 5 years to even understand what he was saying at all. In fact, I could say up to about 5 years reading his own work, I had no clue what the man was talking about at all. And my understandings of his work came through other commenters first. And also, what intrigued me about him was that he was such an expert on the great German poets, and Hölderlin, and on Rilke, and some of the existential poets. Rilke being from Prague originally, but lived for a long time in France. And these were people that I was up on. My tradition coming more from the poetic side, and so to have a philosopher like Heidegger who drew so heavily on the poets, meant that I would have to continue the process of discovering what he said. And if you don't speak German, of course, even philosophers know that's a problem with Heidegger, because it's probably better to understand him in the idiom. So the etymology and the drawing on philology. So all of these were handicaps, which would have normally put another person off. But within Heidegger's work is such an incredible, mellifluous, poetical, antinomian, voice. Which to me, later on, I'd know how to define it more. Oh, this smacks of Taoism, this smacks of even aspects of Jainism. I'd be able to put a language to this later. At the time, it was a completely raw, primitive thing where this fella's saying something, stick around, keep penetrating it. I knew to stick around. And even though I was a novice in philosophy, I had come from other traditions, like I said, the poetical and mystical occult. So I never, when I read Hegel, when I was reading, I go to these academic classes when I started learning philosophy. However, I was different than all the students and pupils in there. I may not have had the strict academic philosophical background, but I had an occult background. So it was no difficulty for me then to read the Hegels and the Descartes and all of these people in both a religious, theological understanding, and more than that, a hermetic, would probably be more accurate to call hermetic. And then later on, lo and behold, you actually find out that many of these actual philosophers were themselves. I mean, this was a surprise. I didn't realize it at the time. But the Hegels and the Schopenhauers were very much enamored. This goes even for Nietzsche. Were either highly influenced or at least deeply involved in studying these other traditions. So in fact, rather than feel alienated from reading their work, slowly even a greater bond happened. And if that had not have taken place, then there would have been no way to really get into Heidegger's work at all. Because one of the actual avenues, there's several avenues into the work of Heidegger. One is from the strict philosophical point of view. The other is from the existential point of view. The other is from the linguistic point of view. We can maybe talk a bit about that aspect, people use that as a way into his work. And believe it or not, the other one is a mystical way in. He may have never said that or admitted it in so many words, but it nevertheless is the case that the Book of Tea and the Tao Te Ching, right, and other Oriental philosophies certainly, influenced his work.
I think he said, I know it was a book by Suzuki, he said everything you said in there, that's an embodied. I've been trying all my life to say.
Yeah, that's right. That's right, and it didn't come out as strongly, but he was known to have read these works. They were on his desk, and basically he never denied it. Heidegger's famous for never admitting anything, right? But again, that's his own idiosyncrasy, and that should be respected rather than condemned. I consider him a very deep thinker, and certainly has changed my life profoundly. Because if a philosopher doesn't change your life intimately, individually, I really fail to see the point of studying them, reading them, teaching them. You know what I mean? It becomes a completely a food for the mind type of affair. But let's just maybe talk about the linguistic aspect. George Steiner, and other people who've been very helpful. So people coming to Heidegger for the first time, but have a background in linguistics. For those who come into Heidegger for the first time, and have a background in linguistics, then the George Steiner work, by getting into the philology of Heidegger, is very important. And what I only know about the linguistic aspect is that Heidegger was really concerned with Sprach, the speech. And this is one of the poetic elements of his work that hypnotized me so much. In his later life, he even emphasized that there's a very difference between chit-chat, which is what everyone does, and Sprach, which is the speaking. And in true speech, when you're speaking about philosophical ideas, and this is almost Socratic in the way he puts it, is that also even the pauses between what you say, the silence in between, is part of the speaking, is part of the enunciation. This is magnificent, But more technically speaking, he was a man who basically had problems with every philosopher in the whole philosophical tradition from the time of Plato, including Plato. He was more forgiving with pre-Socratic philosophers, but had endless problems with Aristotle and Plato and the whole tradition. He loved the Greek language, and he believed that many of the Greek terms, because Greek was the first, well, this is arguable, but for technical purposes, Greek was the first language to work in philosophy. Many of the words of philosophy come from Greek, like onto and all of this. And he believed that there was already contamination in the outset regarding the language of Greek and its application. This is a linguistic thing, and time to go into it deeply. And he believed that the culprits were these Athenian philosophers. And to speak very broadly about it, he believed that Aristotle and Plato had taken philosophy off into a completely other direction, and it was no longer philosophy. And he said that it's because in metaphysics and in philosophy in general, the real meaning of life is to do with being and existence. And that they had sort of stepped past that. They use those terms, they speak about it. But in their mind, and again, I'm not using Heidegger's words here, I'm using my words. I have to emphasize that these are my interpretations of Heidegger. I'm not a Heideggerian expert or anything like that. He would have, in my words, I interpret Heidegger to have meant that these Socratics, as well as all the philosophers that stem from them, and including their refuters, are interested in with what is called essences. There is actually a big controversy, a dichotomy in philosophy about existence versus essence. And this turns up time and time again in the work of Heidegger, because which came first. It's like the chicken and the egg type of concept, right? To put it very simply. And essences is basically that which you can't see with your senses. And of course Heidegger would critique this. But to put it in simple terms, is that an essence is obviously, like for instance God, is an essence. God is obviously not hiding or lurking behind the clouds. He's not hiding in the woods somewhere. You know, I've described it in the article. He's not hiding in a cave waiting to be discovered by some Indiana Jones type. He's a concept of the mind. He's people's abstraction, saying, oh, we think this all, you know, came about through some primal cause or omnipotent intelligence. So basically, without talking religious terms, then that's an essence. And there's many other kinds of essences as well.
It does really begin with Plato with the forms.
Yeah, yes, exactly. Now Plato had this heavily. Plato's work was imbued with all of this. Now don't forget, the first person who comes to Plato, and it depends how you come to Plato. If you're coming to Plato through a theological background, you're going to love Plato. Because on paper it sounds wonderful. It sounds absolutely wonderful. You know, that all reality is an illusion. You know, and behind it is the real, which he called the forms. Which are archetypes. Somebody would go, oh, I understand that. That's the antitypes, the archetypes, the forms. Yes, but then, okay, in book after book after book, including the Republic, he never nails down what these forms are. He doesn't explain them in any type of detail. We've never been able to find them, and in 2,000 years, we haven't made a single ounce of progress to discover what these so-called forms are. So again, they were a hypothetical construct, which I describe as a mysterium. That's a singular word meaning mystery, mysteria meaning the plural of that. And I believe that the world, that's why I did this article and DVD, is because I believe that the world is mysteria haunted. Right? It's a philosophical concept. And Heidegger would have said that this all begins with the Platonics. Because even though it sounds wonderful and ever so mystical and ever so holy, and ever so promising of a final eventual enlightenment, that once you are able to contact this forms, or once they contact you, you know, the whole simile of once you come out of the cave, come out of ignorance, this is all wonderful, this is all romantic. And when it's these holier than thou toga wearing, you know, Athenian thinkers, this has an enormously hypnotic, you know, it's a huge sell. Until Heidegger comes along with the bad news that it's all a bunch of bunk. But by that time, you know, the rationalist school had already basically foundered. By the time of Heidegger and the existentialists, the rationalists had died under their own weight. So his job was slightly made a bit easier. Nietzsche is basically the man who put the you know, he's like the Clint Eastwood, come on sucker, you know, puts the bullet through the, you know, the forebrain. Heidegger was the burial guy. He's the guy who, you know, dug the grave and covered it over. And Kierkegaard in there, you know, as well, to a certain extent. But who was it say? Somebody said that, you know, until they had read Nietzsche, I think it was like the dawn on the horizon or something like that. Somebody, it was Copplestone or somebody said that unless you've read Nietzsche, you know, it was like the sun had finally risen on the horizon of understanding or something like that. And it's so true. And this tradition, of course, carries on even in Aristotle, who appears on the surface to be a very practical, you know, rational disciple of reason. But in many ways, Heidegger would critique him too, because even the reason of philosophers is a mysterium to a degree, or an essence. To be more specific, Heidegger would have said, there is something that comes before thought, or there is something that is an object of thought that should be thought about, and that is existence. And this has certainly never been given anything like the thought it really deserves. What does he mean by this? It's the whole essence existence thing again, but restated in a way. Obviously, in order to think. Okay, let's take it in stages. Descartes addressed somewhat of the same question. What can I know? I see the world. I see the world around me. I see the shapes and forms. I have an idea of myself, you know. But I can see a candle looking like a real candle. But if it melts, it looks like wax. Are those one and the same thing? Clearly, they're not. So I do see things, but my senses could be deceived. You know, I could see sheets of ice. You know, the whole landscape could be covered in snow. Am I aware that those are made up of individual snowflakes? Of course not. But they are, right? So, again, it depends on perspective. So he started then to say, you know, I have to basically start with doubting everything I know. And very quickly, Descartes' procedure was, oh, wait a minute, if there's a doubter, there must be a thinker, And if there's a thinker, there must be existence. And so he came across his definition of existence through this idea of cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. Heidegger was dealing very much with the same concepts, but in a different way. And this is without, by the way, getting into all the other sub-critiques of Descartes. We'll just jump over those right now and return to Heidegger. He was saying that, look, before you can think, you must exist. In fact, he described it again in poetic language by saying that being opens a door for thinking. Or even thinking opens a door for being. You can see it either way. By thinking about the wrong things, you're not thinking. It's very German, it's very existentialist, I know. But this is, to me, this is extremely profound. By not thinking about what thinking should be thinking about, you're not thinking. And the ultimate goal of thinking, which another philosopher would call an object of thought, is existence. No one today is thinking about existence or being, right? Because you're not thinking about existence and being, you're actually not really thinking at all. And therefore, Heidegger had a multiplicity of ways of describing that inauthentic, to use a very broad existentialist term, inauthentic state of consciousness, that he subdefined as being das Man and all these other terms that are sort of irrelevant for this dialogue here. But he basically divided man, as Kierkegaard did, into the authentic and inauthentic individual. And the inauthentic individual is thinking, but he's thinking about, things that are not important in a philosophical sense. And then, relating to what we've just been saying in the last lot of minutes, he includes that to be the highest philosophers of the land. The greatest philosophers who ever lived, he puts into that same category, perhaps for slightly different reasons, but nevertheless, he put them all in that category. A guy like that's not going to he's not going to be invited to too many parties, and he's not going to have too many friends. So this describes, the backlashing against Martin Heidegger. He said that thinking opens a door for being to enter. He really often spoke in terms of being in the German as a presence, as an actual thing, it's a real thing. But to stick more to what he was saying, when you are thinking about existence, and he then even changes the terminology. He moves from saying you think about being to that you care for being. He changed the term. In German it's Sorge, right? It's a profound sense of caring. Other people would call it loving, and of course then we have all the baggage that word has, so we never use it. Caring is a far deeper word. In fact, Thomas Moore, the author, pointed out that the word cure, which meant priest, is the equivalent of the word care. And in Thomas Moore's work, he said that at a time of great grieving, like at a death of a parent or grandparent, everyone gathers, everyone dresses in black, everyone is somber, and everyone's in deep grief. The cure, or the priest, is there to remind you of the presence of death. And not that they're actually doing this, of course, the Christians, but that's the theory. And the higher theologians know this. He's there to be the presence behind the grieving, to say all is sorrow. Sabhe dukkam, and he's the one you rest on or you turn to say, Father, what is this all about? All is suffering, all is... So the presence of the cure is to remind you, wake up from the cups and the saucers, like Rilke has so beautifully described. Get up from the table, walk out and find the church that your fathers forgot. Answer the call of being. Theology, of course, has abused this. So have the philosophers, according to Heidegger. Let's bring it back. Bring back the intense awareness of the care of your existence. How it becomes existentialism is why I'm most intrigued personally, is because he's saying care about your existence. Do not contaminate what I'm saying with the care of humanity's existence, brother, next door neighbor, the underprivileged, the oppressed, whatever. We're talking only in existential terms here about your own profound relationship with yourself, if that's even possible. Which Heidegger doubted because he had a whole class of people who can't do this, the inauthentic das Man. He was under no illusions about it. Neither was Sigmund Freud, by the way. But the point being that keep this private, because it's not your beingness, your sense of existence is really ultimately not the same as others. Later on in the second part of Being and Time, he spoke more broadly about mass movements, and how we are kindred. So he wasn't an existentialist in the hardcore tradition. He also talked about all of mankind's responsibility for this. But in the earlier works, he was very much focused in a strictly, you wake up to the power and the significance of your own life and your own existence. And you do that also in a way that involves facticity, you know, wake up to your own existence. And on a recent interview on Red Eyes Creations, I tried to give a few, it was very brief so we couldn't get into it, that might even involve people to do certain meditations. You know, in fact, it might even take a physical visitation. I mean, literally for a person to go back to the street and look at the front door of the house in which they were born. Of course, a lot of this can be done mentally. Lie in bed one day and just think of your whole life from the beginning, from day one, the cot that you were born in, the smell of the blanket, you know, the pencil that you wrote with in school, all the various smells and odors that you knew, what it felt like to see an animal for the first time, what it was like to be transfixed by a painting. All those experiences, the feeling of water on your hands, hot and cold, pain, sorrow, you know, the light coming through the window, whatever. These existentialistic visions are not collective. Somebody will say, oh, what they are. Everybody has an experience of fire and water. From Heidegger's point of view, that's irrelevant. No, you are the one who had the experience, and that particular experience is absolutely unique to you. It's only later on, because you have to coexist with other people, and you have to seek approval from those people, and you have to wear a social mask, that then you lose your center and selfhood and the uniqueness of these experiences. I always point to the movie Fearless, which I believe is from beginning to end an entirely Heideggerian film. There's others as well. And in which the person has now been re-identified through a death experience. In Heidegger's later work, of course, he talked about being unto death as being one of the critical factors that brings you back into the presence of existence or being, is what it was first coined by Kierkegaard, which is the being unto death, which in simple layman's terms is just the feeling of mortality. The Damocles sword that you know is finite. Your life is going to end one day. And this will give tremendous lucidity. And it will stop this chit-chat. And it will stop this irrelevancy that exists in all people's lives. It's facticity again. Death is inevitable. Of course, he'd hope, as all Taoists and philosophers hope, that it would go to the level you're talking about, where a person would have a daily, momentarily cognizance of death imminently. Yeah, you're talking about 1 in 300 million people, right, who may have that. And even then, they may not have it in an authentic way. It may be a paranoid, neurotic. There's many neurotics all over the world who go, I never stop thinking about that. Yeah, because you're afraid to die. That's a different thing. No. Seeing life and death in a philosophical way is a very Taoist thing, because they're acting all the time on one another. You can't have one without the other.
It's the polarity, isn't it, between birth on the one hand and death on the other, and the mysterious current of life.
Sufis, for instance, say that between each breath is a pause. Right? You have life, you have the death, and then new breath. So it's literally there in everything, is the so-called death. That word is so loaded, of course. And this is why Heidegger was, like I said before, you can enter his work through, if people are interested in linguistics, because he was a real wordsmith, in the sense that he altered and changed words in this way in order to create a new language to describe things that are so contaminated that we simply can't understand what he meant, or a good philosopher like him, because the word is so loaded with prejudice. So he literally tried to coin his own language, and most academic commenters on Heidegger applaud him, think he did a good job. He has some critics, but the intelligent people think he did a wonderful, wonderful job, including using this word Das Ein. Das Ein is the man who's awakened to thinking about existence or caring for existence. He used this term Das Ein, as opposed to another kind of man who couldn't give a monkeys about it. They're called Das Man, and that meant not just an individual man, the hollow man of T.S. Eliot, but the mass man as well. It had two terms. The they, yeah, in German, exactly. And you see, the other fascinating thing for me, as I said or hinted earlier, is that I was unable to understand Heidegger in his own idiom. But what I did understand, I was relating because of the other paradigms I'd been long exposed to, like art. For instance, for all my favorite artists were surrealists, like René Magritte and Salvador Dali and Giorgio de Chirico and all these people. And they are putting into painting or putting into aesthetics the teachings of these great existentialists. So, and same with the poets like Rilke and all this. And not only that, but even in modern movies, I think Heidegger has, people should realize just how important his philosophies are in music, even in many rock bands, and certainly in modern movies. It's part of the reason why, I wanted to start doing this work more publicly at this aspect of my own life, is because I see it so much now, and this existentialism permeated into literature. We couldn't have a Hermann Hesse. You couldn't have a Colin Wilson. You really would be handicapped today. The whole outsider, Steppenwolf, loner type of individual, this idiosyncratic loner type, is all the product of these kinds of thinkers. Okay, we know it more in fiction, but it actually started somewhere. He was speaking about a very caring thing, in a way, a sort of compassion that no Christian has ever come close to. You know, although he probably hate that word. Again, care. This deep sense of awareness, but tried not to broaden it so that it becomes collective. You can't care for another person. You can't love another person. This is all nonsense. First of all, you can't have it if you don't have it for yourself, right? This is just another important point. But talking about the dread and the being unto death, he said, of course, people in later life, it's not going to hit the 20-year-old who's partying from morning to night, but it's certainly going to hit older people will start gaining this. Or if you have a major tragedy in your life, or you happen to be of a very philosophical bent. But the masses are never going to be involved in this. But the philosophical person who starts to realize their own mortality, he's obviously said, but he said it in philosophical language, that that gives you imminence. You become very aware of, you know, the finiteness of your life. In poetical terms, how this is expressed, and this is again one of the most things that you know, affected me so deeply, again because the background was from art, is that then what about the inanimate? If you're really present, doesn't the light on that vase and the existence of this table matter? The chair I'm sitting in is just a dead thing that just happens to fit your ass, and the door handle just happens to be a thing you open to the door. And the great sculptor Henry Moore would have perked up at this point, because Henry Moore, from birth to death, kept talking about how people just relate to things functionally. You know, this is a man who created a sculpture, you know, a beautiful nude, because the hills in the background had the same shape. So if this is going to be in a museum courtyard, he's already thinking about the topography around. That's Heidegger. That's existentialism. That's the understanding of the microcosm and the macrocosm. We have no conception of this. We'll sit behind a cubicle for 60 years. You know, we'll be suit and tie and, you know, just complete prisoners without even noticing it. Right? So again, to speak in aesthetic terms, he would say, like William Blake had said so beautifully in ages past, is not the rain, the wetness of the tiles, the dew on a horse's back, the leaf blowing down the street, human? It might even be more human than you imagine yourself to be, because existentially speaking, if you're a Das Man, maybe you don't even deserve that term human, and even other inanimate things have more humanity than you do, because they are present, they're in the now. So the thing that really interested me and really motivated me to keep studying him was this thing about the inanimate, because independently and privately I'd come to the same conclusion. And that is, we become so dependent on other human beings because we seek the approval. We need their cues and affectations. Then, unfortunately, like all the psychologists have so many times pointed out, and then you don't get it, because, of course, you may want something, doesn't mean that life's going to respond. So the child growing up wants the approval of X, Y, and Z, finds out that, okay, it doesn't come on cue, and then you have the inevitable neuroses, which arises when you don't have the approval of other people. And then you have the psychic breakdown. This is one of the things that makes you a non-human being. Is because by not receiving what you think you need, because you're now so dependent on others, and if they don't give you the cues and affectations back, because you're too fat, you got pimples on your face, you know, you speak funny, you know, whatever it might be, we know all this stuff. When you don't get that, then you become a neurotic individual. And by becoming a neurotic individual, why this was so interesting to me, from a conspiratorial point of view, why it plugged into that, is because what happens to the neurotic individual? He becomes vulnerable to control from above. So people who think this digression into Heidegger is just, what the hell's Tsarion on about now? He's, you know, got nothing else to do but this. It's fundamental to the whole understanding of the matrix or architecture of control. Because that neurotic individual who's become not only fixated on expectation, fixated on goals, fixated on the approval of other people, who will now conform and do anything to get that approval, meaning weaken his sense of self to the point where it doesn't even exist, etc., etc., etc. Demand other people around him, including his most intimate people in his life, to do the same thing to receive that approval. Who will play games with other people to say, if you're not giving me the approval, I'm not going to give it to you, and then we have the normal dysfunctional relationships. All of this is basically creating the mud that creates the bricks to build the global village and the New World Order. Now, Heidegger didn't go down there and stuff like that. He was an academic, and he kept his critiques of humanity in a philosophical context. But that doesn't mean that other people can't come along and take a philosopher's work and apply it in other areas, you see. So this was very, very important. So with one level, I was intrigued by what he was saying, and you could interpret it as he did in this beautiful poetic way. And by the way, just as an anecdote, When Heidegger spoke in the classroom, the entire college would be outside the door and lining the hallways, including the teachers, to listen to the way that he spoke, the way he used language and the way he explained the most simplest things. It was absolutely unique in the world, and it's absolutely stupefied people. Nobody had ever heard this before. The use of language, the way that he put you into contact with all that invisible, inanimate things. What's the light doing? The light's changing every 5 minutes. The clouds pass. You know, you are here, but you're not aware of that you're here, you know. And all of these other anecdotes that he so wonderfully brought out. This was intriguing to people. It took philosophy in a completely other direction. And of course scared the bejesus out of all these New Yorkers and other, you know, people who thought they were the hegemony in philosophy, you know. So this is tremendous. But the other aspect was this whole idea of the breaking of dependency. You can't come to selfhood if you are utterly transfixed by the levels of approval and status quo of other people. Then if we shift gear a bit and talk about that, Heidegger also, his ultimate metaphysic was that there is a reality, but you're never going to find it. First, if you don't have the care for being, that's fundamental. But even leaving that aside, you're never going to find it expressly through the operation of reason. Oh, don't say that. All the philosophy is based on that. What are you talking about now? He said, I've already told you that thinking is later, it's one stage later than existence. Reasoning is one stage later yet again. How can reason ever know its parent? Any more than a baby at 3 can understand that its mother has her own name, she's dated X, Y, and Z, she likes this kind of perfume, she has her own life. It's impossible. The child only sees an image of the mother in relationship to its own needs. It cannot understand what parenthood is or any of these other things. So in the same way, reason is inadequate. Reason is brilliant. All philosophers have the highest respect for reason. But the Heideggers of the world will always remind you, and I put it in these words: you have one life to live, and you have infinite things to know. Stop right there. Do you not see the contradiction? You have infinite things to know, but you have temporary time to know it. And you admittedly, the highest scientists admittedly tell you, and the reason by which you're going to know things is limited in of itself. I think we got problems here. I think we need to have a roundtable meeting in the whole world over this point. Do you mean to tell me that I might have existed for 30 years or whatever many years, and you never told me that there's an inherent contradiction in all of this? Then maybe the Taoists are right. Maybe the Heideggerians are right. That they posit that there possibly is an all-knowingness, but it's certainly not going to happen through the aspects of reason, by the simple, clear fact that you have one short life to live, an imperfect reason that can be mistaken, and yet you have infinite things to know. So the only answer is you're either going to not know everything, which totally radically changes everything, you know, we're about, or you can know everything, but you can't necessarily use the road of reason, and also science and technology, which are based on reason.
This is what you said regarding scientism, not being able to give the
Right.
life.
Scientism is a perfect way to express it, because otherwise people think you're bashing science. I'm not bashing man's technical abilities. We're talking philosophy here. We're not critiquing, in fact, everything we've got. Painting a picture, riding a horse, creating a fishing net to catch fish, putting up a tent, obeying the climate when your tribe moves is all technology, technicalness. It's a technical ability. Making the cell phone, making the computer, making the camera. When Heidegger was expressing technology, he was speaking about a different kind of thing. He was speaking about a kind of thought process, a mechanical, fixed, immutable thought process that people can have their reason become. He wasn't against reason, but he was saying, what is guiding reason? If care of being, if das Ein is not guiding reason, then reason will get into all sorts of problems. And he would have pointed even to the great champions of reason as being the men who got into the problems, ergo Kant and Hegel and all of these people. And he wasn't the first to say that. In other words, to make it simple, the disciples of reason, that I call the disciples of the Mysterium, crumbled under their own weight. They are the first to show you that their systems were unsustainable. Heidegger would have said, there you go, that's what I'm talking about when I say that reason operating on its own is incapable to have all-knowing. Maybe then you might have to say all-knowing is impossible. But if we say that, then, my God, the whole complexion of human existence and history dramatically changes. And it's also dangerous to say that, because then you're into that whole world of Hegel and the scientism, who says, we've been telling you that for years. One man can't have all knowing. So it's a chain of men down through history. Now that's tantamount to saying the individual is but a domino in an endless chain of faceless scientists, faceless technicians. We're into the world of H.G. Wells, and again we're back to Big Brother again. Rubbing his hands, going, good, right? The faceless scientist. Okay, yeah, around Einstein and others, we have a cult of personality, but that's irrelevant. In factual terms, the scientist is absolutely anonymous. He's basing his science on previous scientists. Another person will take up the baton, right, and carry on. And so what we have here is collectivism incorporated. And I really tried to emphasize this in the work that we did, because then you have collectivism smuggling itself in. Because if knowledge, final enlightenment, utopia, revelation, social justice, social perfection, if all of these things are found in time through evolution, progress, etc., then you're no better than Calvinism, you're no better than the behaviorist model, you're no better than the rational model. And I like to use this term scientism because, as I said, I'm not bashing science, but the essence, the ideology, scientism is the ideology that scientists have, whether they express it or not. Behind science is an idea that progress comes tomorrow after the selfless sacrifice, the altruistic, personless discovery of all of these mini test tubes dressed in white to come to this final revelation. It's no better than the religion. In fact, that's what scientism is. It's a theology of science. And this is what Heidegger was critiquing, because it's preposterous. Henry Bergson and others had critiqued it in their own way before. The Taoist sage sits in his shack and says the same thing. Oh, he says, there is all-knowingness. There's a complete understanding of the totality, but it's not in time. So then you have to then get into a philosophical critique of what is time, which Heidegger did beautifully in the later parts of Being and Time. But my reading of it is simple. Let's keep it very simple. If you don't really understand that there is a complete way for you, like the ancient shamans understood, like the Druids understood, you can in fact come to all-knowingness, but it's in a way that has never been defined in modern times. Certainly the science is not defining it. And more, even let's take it even one level more simply than that. Science is all about Archimedean points. Just like Plato, they want to find that adamantine platform from which you can phallically view the whole world of reality from a fixed point. Fixed laws, right? They invent them, so in my work they're a Mysterium because they just invent it from their mind when they feel like it. David Hume, you only have to go to David Hume to realize that none of this, the entire basis of science is utterly hypothetical, because the 1700s philosopher David Hume shows that causality is purely an assumption. It's a hypothetical construct, right? But in this seek for certainty, in this seeking for, what would you call it, the paradigm, you know, cracking the code as they put it themselves, you know, the God cipher, everybody trying to find the back door into reality, is already what I call Mysterium generated, because reality has one thing, the true reality has one hallmark, one indisputable fact. It changes every minute. And therefore there can be no fixed understanding of reality. Bruce Lee, in one of his movies, put it this way. He says, each moment changes you. You cannot even know yourself. How can you hope to hold or know anyone or anything else? The true existential person is very cognizant of that change and all the things that cause this change. Moods come into it, emotions, experiences. Again, pointing to the movie Fearless, this person eating a strawberry has lived 100 lives. If you watch this one scene, just in the biting and eating of a strawberry, Peter Weir is showing you what I'm talking about. T.S. Eliot would call it, at the still point, the dance is. That is where the dance is, at the still point. And this can be found in all the deepest shamanic traditions. So the point is that his refutation of science is that we need science for its pragmatic purposes. Wonderful. Building houses and, you know, jet planes and all of these things. But the scientism that belies it is telling you that everything is coming in the future, because they've understood this. Subliminally, they've understood that you can't have all knowing. So they give you this panacea. This is the carrot. Tomorrow, tomorrow, tomorrow. And my interest is then under that auspices comes in the tyranny, comes in the social tyranny, and also comes in the mental tyrannies as well. And then, of course, you can't be critiquing things without giving the alternative. So my work is then to try and give people that, present people at least with an idea of that there is an alternative to this. And I use the Heideggerian model to get to this part of my thesis, which is there is a way for all knowingness and all understanding, but it's not through reason, right, essentially. It's not through ego constructs. It's certainly not through your social ego persona. It's not through any form of collectivism at all. And it's not necessarily even through human beings, in your relationships with one-to-one human beings, which has become the whole cult of, well, you can't know yourself unless you know other people. That's true to a point, right? It's very valid. But the turning within, and also in my canon, you know, from the Druidic point of view, what about the inanimate? That's even a misnomer to even call things inanimate. It's hideous to call the light or a table an inanimate object. This is, again, this speciesism, if you want to call it, or some form of, it's a form of tyranny, actually. And then one other most important aspect to this connects directly with my theories on the Mysterium, which ultimately are based in psychology, or let's call it existential psychology. The Mysterium is basically an account of all human neuroses. Right? We've been talking about philosophy, but to be really truthful about it, the Mysterium concept that I have comes under the umbrella of Otto Rank and the Neo-Freudians and their existentialist psychological paradigms. It's a way to explain all human pathology. And to quickly bring it up, quickly explain it, we turn to Jung and Freud here. Jung believed that the unconscious mind was a very powerful thing. And of course, it's street-level textbook, you know, a coffee table book psychology is that all psychologists ask you to open the deeper reservoirs of the mind, you know, work with the unconscious elements and so on. Of course, it goes much deeper than that. However, even those teachers and psychologists of the highest level, like Freud and Jung, who were great champions of the unconscious, and that we needed to open up and be more holistic, unfortunately, they also felt that the unconscious mind has spurious, potentially negative, and in many cases even evil complexions. Right? This is not me making this up, this is in their work. For instance, to give you a concrete example, Jung's archetype, the most important archetype in the Jungian paradigm is called the anima. And it's all mankind's and womankind's ideas about what woman is, what mother is, what nature is. And these are all individual thoughts thought over the millennia that become concepts and that finally get embedded into the race memory and finally get embedded into the deeper parts of the unconscious as what he referred to as an archetype, basically a numinous embedded idea. And over the thoughts of every human being that's ever lived, these archetypes have enormous power because they're not your personal content, they're the content of all people who've ever had experience of what womankind is, both the good and the negative. And there's the key word negative, because in the normal accepted understanding of the archetypes, which again is the content of the unconscious, all archetypes, according to Freud and Jung, have this ambivalent split personality. I said Freud there, people go, no, you're wrong, Freud never even talked about the archetypes. No, but he talked about the pre-conscious content. So, to all intents and purposes, he understood that the content of the unconscious has a negative aspect. Because remember, Freud thought that everything in the unconscious is the dumping ground of your conscious life. Those are just basically psychic garbage. That's what I mean. Jung took it a step further and said, oh, the archetypes are very necessary, you can't live a whole life without them, but be careful because they have this burning side. All man's experience of womankind hasn't always been pleasant down through history. There's the Medea, right? There's the Circe, there's the Salome, there's the evil mother, there's the smother mother. So in his lexicon, he would say, and also the animus and the archetypes, anima, they have a little bit of a negative side. I believe the same thing, but I've changed it. I think he was misguided there. I don't think the archetypes themselves are negative. I believe there's what might be called a personality that stands in the twilight zone between the realm of the archetypes and the realm of the ego, like a kind of a worm tongue, to borrow from Professor Tolkien's work. An ambassador between the worlds. In fact, if you read many mythologies, you'll find this in Scandinavian mythologies called Loki. There's actually a presence, a semi-archetypal presence, who wears two masks. One face is like a Janus-type figure, who faces the unconscious, receives the data and the information that the unconscious is giving him, the archetypes are saying, well, here, take this, quick, come on, take this. And he stands on the bridge between the worlds. But he turns around and brings to the ego all this content and information, but he's first censored it, in the same way that a prison warden will censor the information that's being sent to a certain prisoner. And that's what we are in the realm of the ego, we're the prisoner. The ego thinks it's getting uncensored information. Well, first of all, the ego has its own defenses against the unconscious, but even leaving that aside, when unconscious content comes into the ego, as a matter of fact, it's already been processed by the intelligence network. And down through centuries, we imagine that this is good data. Actually, what this is to do is to bring in unconscious content, because the Mysterium knows that without any connection to the unconscious, you have instant pathology and the ego would be imploded. So, damn it, we need to have those rivers in some form coming into the ego. But the last thing you want is a complete connection between the two worlds. So Jung believed it's the archetypes who have this ambivalent character. I believe, like William Blake, that all the content of the unconscious is holy. If you read William Blake's poetry, you will never understand either his iconography, his poetry, or anything he talks about without understanding that this man looked upon what he called the imaginatio, imagination is his word for the unconscious, as being 100% sacrosanct. And he believed that anything that is negative, anything that is evil, and he certainly believed in that, is not of that world. It's either of the ego world, or he had other explanations for it. Coming back to my own take on this, he believed that the imagination is where your selfhood lies. And the ego has a need to not bond with that. So I believe then that the psychologists who say, beware the id, beware the unconscious, because it will overwhelm the ego, have been mistaken. The id, the unconscious, does not seek to overwhelm the ego, it seeks to embrace it. And it is only because of the disinformation and misinformation of what I refer to as the Mysterium, which is this parasitical evil twin of the ego, if you will, that over centuries of misinterpreting the nature of our own unconscious to our ego, that the ego has a very ambivalent and fearful relationship to the unconscious. What's this all about? It comes back to your question about dread. When you say about people having fear of death, I know what's happening in people's mind as soon as you say a concept like that. You're thinking of death out there. The real dread that the existentialists were talking about was this, because remember, in German it's Angst. Anxiety and fear are not the same thing at all. Fear is a legitimate fear. Shit, that lion's going to eat me. That's legitimate fear.
It's fear of something, isn't it?
Yes, outside you, and it's a real fear. Shit, a bunch of skinheads are coming around the corner, let's go. Right? That's real fear. Angst is some indefinable aspect of yourself that you're not in touch with, that's keeping you awake, giving you depressions, making you feel real low, you know, all the mood. That's anxiety. The dread, when Heideggers are talking about being unto death and the fear of death, he's not talking about, oh, there it is, you know, death, I might be hit by a train tomorrow. Of course we don't bother with thinking with that, and if we did, we'd be neurotic. He was speaking about, you know, I'm not going to go out, you know, I might get a cold if it's raining, drop a rain on my window, you know, I'm going to catch pneumonia type of thing. Sounds like my family. Anyway, the point is that, you know, yeah, if you kiss a girl, you know, she's going to get pregnant. The thing is that the angst is an internal thing. You know, it's like Clint Eastwood in High Plains Drifter. It's what people know about themselves inside that makes them afraid. You know, it's what inside we have the fears. Touching that positively is good, but the ego has a tremendous feeling that this thing that it is defined in negative terms as this murky ocean, this pleroma, nebulous, threatening, unconscious, is ready to wash up and overflow it. And you have this imagery throughout psychology and even now in the mainstream. This has no meaning for Blake. This has no meaning for Rilke. This has no meaning for Holderlin. This has no meaning for, you know, the existentialist poets or for Dali or any of these people. It had no meaning for Nietzsche. Nietzsche's going, dive in. Dive in. He'll be okay. You'll float. What? You know, no, let's build some canals. Get a boat. Where's my oars? You know. He's going, no. The Hopis are saying, it's okay, let go. Let go. You'll handle it, right? So we have this consciousness, which is the boat. And we have the oars, which is the ego. And the more you're pumping the oars, you're letting the ego decide on your navigation system. Without the oars, the boat will just follow the course of the river. So we're not we're not, how would you say it, debunkers or deconstructionists in the sense that we don't want to have consciousness or egoism for that matter. But we are saying that the river knows where it's going. And that which designed the river knows where it's going. Schopenhauer, for instance, had probably one of the most powerful explanations of this. He said, imagine life and death like striking a match. When you strike a match, the match is matter, it's a wood, and it's a bit of sulfur at the top. You strike a match and this etheric thing appears, called a flame. And then, like a candle or a match, the flame will eat up the matter, the content of the physical matter, and then expire and disappear from whence it came. What has happened? The match, which is the body, the human body, has expired. But the light that came into that body, or, you know, in other words, the flame on the match, you could strike another match and there's that flame again. In fact, you could fill the planet and the universe with expired matches, and the flame is not reduced one bit. So he said that that which is matter can perish, but that which brought matter into existence is imperishable. Blakes of the world, Rilkes of the world, Magritte of the world, even to a certain extent the T.S. Eliots of the world, and other individuals have an understanding that this unconscious realm is that all-pervading. Now it's being given, you know, here we got the Greg Braden cult, and we got everybody else calling it the Stills point, and we have a whole new languaging, which is fantastic about this realm. And once a person allows themselves to get in touch with this, you know, then we have the problems. Then we solve the problems. Now, remember I was just saying a few minutes ago that my work is to present people with the alternative to the problem? So all this languaging about oneness, and all this languaging about doing that, which means merging with the unconscious, in my opinion will never happen until we negotiate this Janus-like, parasitical, worm-tongue, magus between the worlds entity. So all talk about, yeah, it's going to happen, merging with the unconscious, bit of yoga, bit of shamanism, you know, you haven't dealt with the real problem. There is a shell around the ego, and it was born from a protective purpose. In my work I talk about how the ego and the Mysterium grew together. They're part of the same root. They grew from the trauma of the world, which is caused by physical catastrophe. It was there for a reason. But it likes its suzerainty now. It feels it's the great protector of... It's what the Gnostics called the demiurge, by the way. There's many other ways of languaging this depending on what tradition you're coming from. And, you know, the Christians will call it the tempter and all of this kind of thing. But until you negotiate that particular aspect, and I call it the mask of the Mysterium, I've even described it as physically as wearing a mask. Not the same as a persona concept, but a different mask, a mask that's almost nailed onto yourself. And this mask has two different colored eyes. So no matter what you do when you're looking at the world, as long as you're looking through the Mysterium, you will see duality. That's why Descartes, Hegel, all of these people see a split reality, is because they have this mask on their consciousness that inevitably sees a split world, because the mind itself is split. This has been proven even scientifically by Julian Jaynes and people like that, who speak about the bicamerality and so on. So we even have now science that's proven this. And it's very recent. It's a very recent occurrence in life. So man is a very traumatized animal. We're dealing with the very early stages of this. So somebody said, well, are you optimistic then about the future, are you? Yes, I am, because this is a very early stage. And down the line, we probably will deal with the Mysterium problem. And we've already had people in the world who have dealt with it. Martin Heidegger, the Taoists, and so on. And we go from there. But Heidegger's work is very essential because he's a Western mind speaking in a Western idiom. I'm not necessarily a big believer that in order to give languaging to these concepts that you just dive over there into Eastern Tibetanism, Buddhism, shamanism, because a lot of that is covered with baggage, a lot of it has been corporatized, and a lot of it is patently false, including Buddhism and all of these other Eastern Oriental priesthoods. They're priesthoods of the same kind, they're just Christianity under another name. So I prefer to go to the philosophical and existential psychological tradition because they're speaking in modern, scientific, very actually easily understandable and contemporary terminologies, free from a lot of the baggage, even though it's arguable that they have their own baggage too, right? So it's a Western idiom, and it'll be Western people who work this out. It's very doubtful, even though you have Japanese, Taoist, Zen people who are onto this game, but many classes of people in the world are probably not even incapable of working this out because their thinking is not of this. They're entirely Mysterium possessed, Mysterium haunted. And again, give a little bit of an explanation of what the Mysterium is. It's just literally a concept of thought in which when you're looking for reality, you're not looking at the thing of existence itself. You're looking at an essence, you're looking at a god, you're looking at an ideology, a forms and archetypes, a face behind the clouds, or a social concept, like a social utopia, a brotherhood of man, a global, utopia down, scientism, progress in the future, food for all people, perfect socialism, perfect all of this. All of these are also mysteriums, and each person. Since scientific dictatorship, but anything that has this glowing, luminous quality that's going to promising the future and ultimately divorces you from yourself is very much the mysterium. And the mysterium has its reasons for doing this. It wants to keep a division between the unconscious and the conscious mind, which is why the William Blakes are never taught in school, which is why the Dante Gabriel Rossettis or any of the people who worked either partly or very entirely to teach you how to link. They're, of course, played downsized in the academic world, and you have the disciples of the Mysterium being brought to the fore. So this is very palpable. This is not some, vague philosophy. This is absolutely going on in your in daily life, in which there's an enormous control of this, and the power of the Mysterium. Haunted person, they have constellated together in the world. They seek out other like minds, and they control the world. And they almost have a sort of a psychic connection between themselves. A lot of the collectivism that you see, my theories of Mysterium, are a foundation of that. They explain why this collectivism comes about, and what are the sort of needs of that, and why man is a neurotic individual. And one aspect of that is also very important to bring out, is that there actually is a mode. It came from Sigmund Freud, who put language into this, and he called it the Thanatos instinct. It was drastically and brilliantly modified later on by Otto Rank, who said that really the Thanatos instinct is not, as Freud displayed it, some inbuilt, natural, regressive element that drags all matter and all things down into, inertia, although that does exist, that entropy does exist. Rank said, no, the Thanatos instinct, the death instinct, is alive and well in Das Man. When you look at the world of the collective, there it is. Man in forgetfulness of being, in total absence of his self, is the Thanatos instinct at work. It's that numbness, it's that comfortably numbness, it's that forgetfulness of being. And this was very important because there is actually a function in the ego itself to self-destruct or auto-destruct if and when the presence of the unconscious really tries to integrate with you. This happened to Friedrich Nietzsche in his own life, by the way. If you're familiar with the end of Nietzsche's life, I believe this is what happened. And it happens with many people. The lunatic asylums are full of people who've gone through exactly this process. And many people are tantamount to it. Hopefully it'll be a successful transition, and in many cases it's not. When the forces of the unconscious, for whatever reasons, and the ego looks like it's really going to be embraced, not, as I say, absorbed, that's the negative connotation, but embraced by the unconscious, the ego would rather shoot itself through the head at that moment and auto-destruct, which is, I think, comes under the umbrella of the Thanatos instinct. But in simple language, it's just an auto-destruct feature within the ego that it would rather top itself, and we know that as neurosis, psychosis, and schizophrenia. R.D. Laing, who's one of the greatest world's experts on schizophrenia, basically says this in different words, that the schizophrenic person is entirely sane. He's entirely in control of his so-called malady and can turn it off and on at will. He's chosen it as a means for two reasons. One is there's healthy schizophrenics, if I should use that term, who have realized that the normal world is abnormal and they don't want any part of it. So their schizophrenia is as a healthy, idiosyncratic, antinomian reaction to a terribly, terribly dysfunctional world. That's one kind of schizophrenic. But he put his finger on this other kind of individual, this other kind of neurotic or psychotic, who has done something infinitely deeper. He's the self-murdered person. He's not just in healthy rebellion, a bit of an eccentric, against the insanity of normalcy, as Arno Gruen, the psychologist, called it. He is a person who dreads so deeply the chemical wedding, right, and the call of selfhood, that in order to stop himself entering even into the first elements of that road, abandon all hope, all who enter here, he will rather auto-destruct and murder himself. To subdivide that, it actually means the murder of masculinity and femininity. You can see a lot of men walking around who have no masculinity. That's because they've murdered it. In fact, in all people's lives, a time will come when this will happen. And it's just a matter of being able to tell at what age this has happened. And many women are walking around who have no understanding of what femininity is. It's been murdered long ago, either by their mothers or by them. This is going on a daily basis, by the way. But rather than getting into the deeper aspects of this, which I hope to deal with in future work, I just call it the death of the self, or the murdered person. The self-murdered person. The self-murdered person self-murders themselves because they are absolutely in dread of its call of being. They're afraid of what Heidegger asked, the being unto death. However, don't you notice that schizophrenics still seem to operate in the world and eat their food and talk and watch TV, and it's like one flew over the cuckoo's nest, they can play basketball and stuff. So actually, from the world's point of view, from the merely superficial world persona point of view, they're still functionaries. In fact, most of the people you meet in the world working in the corporate system are about as schizoid as you can imagine. But in fact, the more manic you are, the more you fit in, the more you're given kudos. So the person who is schizophrenic or pathological or even psychopathic is actually quite able to function as a normal person. In fact, this is the definition almost of psychopathy or sociopathy, is that they have the most, in fact, there can be the most essence of grace. The essence of cultivation and all of these things, and charm. This is well known, there's even books being written about it now. Although very few books go into the dynamic of what creates a person like that. So as a matter of fact, they seem to be comfortable in the world of the real, the world of the persona, the world of the collective. But inwardly, this is where their problems are. And this is what, my Mysterium thing addresses, as the existentialist psychologists also started to address shortly after Freud's work. See, another way of languaging this is that human beings have ideas about reality that are not necessarily reality itself. You don't need me to tell you that. Psychologists are the experts at showing you that you're doing that. And there's even elements of science that will show you this. In order to open a door to being, there's many approaches. We gave some examples earlier about maybe that a man needs to think back at his own existence, use his memory, or physically go to the places he grew up. I mean, I did this. I did it consciously. I went back to London, I went back to Belfast, I went to places that I'd gone to school. And one courtyard. I was very, very young. It was probably the worst pain. It was the first pain I ever experienced. Was tripping in a hole, running as a little boy. This is basically nursery level, 4 or 5 years of age, and tripping in this hole in the grass and literally twisting my ankle and feeling pain for the first time of that extreme dimension. That was my pain, right? Others would go, no. Everybody suffered things like that. Yes, but then I would respond with what Tennyson said in Memoriam. In Memoriam was written about the death of his friend Arthur Hallam. And he addresses this collectivist, individualistic thing. And in the poem it's so beautifully put, where he says, everybody turns to me and says, why grief? Grief is everywhere. You cry for your friend and you mourn, but you do it too much. It's like Hamlet. What are these robes of black you wear? Why are you in the sable? Yeah, give it up. Move on, And Tennyson says, I have no connection with the world's suffering. I am here with mine. The loss of my friend, his light being lost to the world, and he shifts the energy and he brings it back and says, I suffer. And he made it clear that yes, even though the world's suffering, millions would die and I'd barely bat an eye. Isn't it? It's like that scene in Blackadder where the prince, falls out of love and he goes, I'll never forget her, I'll never forget her. Is dinner ready yet? So millions can die, and we're like, okay, wow. So there is some disconnect. But that still means that when the pain or the angst or this trepidation happens in your life, it's at that moment that you're called back to being. Care, not being a physical priest, but being that aspect of your own mind, this existence calling you. So actually, you don't get back in touch with being through an act of the will. This is very back into philosophy again, because look how important the will played in the lives of people like Schopenhauer, and many other philosophers. And Schopenhauer's been deeply, deeply criticized about even using the word will at all, because it's actually not a very good word to explain what he meant. His will was little more than the unconscious itself and the unconscious drives. And people prefer that he would have used the word energy, for instance, would have helped so much, right? But nevertheless, there is this theory in the philosophy about the will and how much the will of man can, attain, and even you have Nietzsche talking about will to power, certainly deeply misunderstood what he was really talking about there. But to make a long story short, the mystics, the Taoists would say, it is not possible for you to get into touch with being by an act of will. Right? In the sense that what probably they're talking about there is it's not something you can do with the ego that is an absolute contradistinction from this, that's basically programmed to shut being out. You can hardly turn to that doorkeeper, and it's like a black guy going to, a skinhead and asking for directions to the reggae club. Guarantee he's going to tell you in the opposite direction if he'll even tell you that at all. So that's going to end up nowhere. So that, why, don't let, as I said before, don't think that the tiger's going to lead you out of the jungle. So there may have to be then a different type of relationship with the self. And Heidegger has explained this in many ways. They do all agree that if you are conscious of death and this mortality thing, that's a good start in whatever way that you look at this. Or simply, as man tends to do, he comes upon a point in his life, every single human being in their life will come upon this soul-searching period, even the most limited person. What the hell's it all about? I've suffered this tragedy, I just lost a job, my wife took a powder, life's a bitch. Or you just see the wars and tragedies. It's at these moments that, the average person may wake up and all of it. We know all of this. Or another person may be transfixed by a piece of art or whatever. So there are obviously ways that you can come through the circumference of all of this. But I think that what he was really talking about was that once you become disenchanted with a lot of the things of the world, you then start to realize that the only real reality is the reality of change. And it's rather than you trying to inhabit some Archimedean point of permanent stasis, as the Sufis and the Vedics of India said, don't try to build your house in the shadow of a tree. Because the shadow of a tree has a particular habit of moving right, around the tree. So try to then become mutable. Try to become unfixed. Try to adopt a flow, a natural organic flow. And do as nature does. And you then turn back to nature as your guide. And nature will then take up the slack. Because the one thing that must be emphasized when you're talking about any of these subjects, and people go, yeah, I'd like to do that, can you tell me more about it? Is that there is absolutely no A to Z manual of how to do this. As soon as you provide that, you're back to the collective again. You've just smuggled the collective back in another form. Your spinner rack, your new age. All the advice that a person can give is that it's you discovering that you're walking your road, you're caring for your being, and your sense of existence is whatever you happen to make it. This is where the problems arise because people don't want to make that transition. That scares them to death. Which is why I said there's subcategories of dread, there's subcategories of anxiety, not all of them healthy. There's the anxiety of even walking the Siddhartha road.
It's a little like Colin Wilson's Outsider.
Yes, that's right.
It begins with the existentialist standpoint of dread and anxiety, but moves through that to the wisdom and the mysticism towards the end of the book.
Yes, he does. And it's interesting that you mention him because Wilson, like Heidegger, lionizes a certain group of people in the world. He lionizes the musicians and the artists. And that means that there's almost a fifth way of approaching Heidegger, as you correctly pointed out, which is the aesthetic route, particularly through the surrealists. Okay, what does that mean? That means that Heidegger was very optimistic. He said that when the call of being comes to you, it will be from those voices who are themselves less Mysterium possessed. Imagine for a moment that the ego is a dark city with no lights. It's very dark. It's always been dark. But the ego has allowed certain little, it's like a little bit of a rat line or a little bit of a smuggler's cove type of effect, in which it will allow a certain caravan of content from the unconscious to pass through. But it guards those. It's like a checkpoint Charlie situation. Come on, give me your data. This mercurial, two-faced character, who can inhabit Hades, but also Olympus. He changes it, the suit, he edits. But that still means that certain channels are opened. And around those channels are these little oases, where the artists and the poets, the artistes, as Pink Floyd would put it. What's at the end of the wall? The artistes and the, what does he call them, They all hang around the wall. They're close to the wall. They're not actually out of the wall, but they hang around the wall. And they're sort of the, these derelict types. So the artists and the poets are listening to the other side. Their ears are open. Ultimately, the shaman is one step above that. But generally speaking, the people we bump into who inhabit this twilight zone, they are hearing and listening to the noumena. They're listening to that place. And they're the only ones who will transmit to us, through the minstrel and bardic tradition, the muse will speak through them. In other words, the self will speak through them. It's not going to speak through the scientists. In fact, as we progress down through time now, we're going to have some very serious problems with this. The global village is, in my rendition or interpretation of global village, it's what this is. It's a perfect prison to make sure that each man who's inhabiting it has no unconscious. And so what we're seeing today in today's technological world is the replication of the unconscious. We dealt with this in the Architects of Control DVD. There's a replication or artificialization, or what's called a simulacra by the philosopher Jean Baudrillard. Is man becoming as plastic as he can be, as technological as he can be, and also through the virtual reality paradigms and the implanting and all of these other paradigms, is the replication of an artificial unconscious, because the real unconscious is ready to be buried. Religion was doing that under the name of theology, building the gates, or as William Blake would so perfectly put it, binding my joys and with briars. Right? Binding my joys and desires with their filthy briars. You know, he's incredible language for this. Now the theology got exhausted, even though they're still around, and the scientists said, we'll take over the job, bricks and mortar time, and we'll continue building the wall that stands between us and the self, which is ultimately reality. So therefore, at the little gateways and the little broken holes in the fence stand the artists and musicians. And he said that in these people is the only real chance, still, they congregate, and they are disseminators or broadcasters of this, unconscious element. Not all, of course, there's lots of things we could say about that genre and everything, but in pure sense, he spoke about the high-level artists and poets being the voice of being. And then my interpretation, I changed this slightly, or just emphasize a little bit more, and I'd say that these are the men who are less Mysterium possessed, meaning that they've either torn this Mysterium from their face, the mask, and thrown it down, and so they see reality as it actually is, which has a whole bunch of side problems that comes with it, let's also mention. Or they've come into direct physical, mental, psychic proximity to the Mysterium. When you pull down, and this was brought out in the movie Zardoz, when you pull down the curtain or the veil, or you try to go deeper into that place and seek the self, as Dante met a tiger in the first stages, as when he went to the underworld, you are now, the vulture turns to, you're suddenly targeted. What are you doing? And the Mysterium will now actively, not in some amorphous, unconscious way, but you will now be approached by the guard, these police. And this will obviously drive you insane. And so I believe that men are judged, their psychic constitution is actually measurable in the courage that they have when they come into the proximity of the Mysterium in whatever way is unique to them. Unfortunately, the Nietzsches of the world didn't make it. Others do. And it's almost like a crazy horse succeeds. But these are men who changed the world. William Blake said, in his own words, how is it we have come through fires and are yet unconsumed? Right? These are the men who walked into the hells of hells, as Dante did, and emerged sane. They're very few in number. Because the Mysterium will now take you on directly. You will have to deal with that. At Star Trek V, the whole of Star Trek V, which is called The Final Frontier, there's a sort of a man that used to be Spock's mentor, a Vulcan, who is seeking for God. And they even use terms like chakari, representing that they're going through the chakras, they're seeking the final frontier. The final frontier is this, limen that exists between the conscious and unconscious mind. When he gets there, what happens is exactly what I'm talking about. The God that he feels that he meets, it's a very Jehovah-like character, and incidentally, there's all these Celtic or monoliths, these megalithic things that pop out of the ground at the time. That's an interesting aside. But when he finally meets this Jehovah-like figure who pronounces himself to be God, a few minutes later, the main protagonist actually discovers that this is nothing more than a projection of his own face. It's him. It's his alter ego. It's himself. This is magnificent. And then he chooses to dive in and try to kick his ass, and they have this fight. Very much like at the end of C.S. Lewis's book, where he also has a physical combat with his nemesis.
At the end of The Prisoner, of course.
And at the end of The Prisoner, there's a physical tussle. So this is the contact I'm talking about, where you will literally be brought into the presence of the Mysterium itself. Moses, and the idea of Moses meeting God at the burning bush is another metaphor for this. And therefore, the strength, the existential constitution of a man, his psychic constitution, is measured entirely based on this, of how he's going to then deal with that tribulation. So basically, to finish off, to round it up, is that in the idioms of the poets and the shamans, the poets and the musicians and the artists, there is a tendency to be able to get into contact with this, presence that's been referred to in German as being das Ein, and in other traditions it's called in different things. And if you have to use the word, because you're absolutely coming from the religious world, spirit or soul, by all means. It's just it has so much baggage, it's preferable not to use those terms. But this is the perfect thing, and there are many good examples of this. And of course we know that our love of music permeates everybody's life. There's certain things that, she's going to be there regardless of how many phallic towers you build and how many cubicles you build. At some point, in some other way, that force will enter through music or poetry or what have you. And it will be there in that moment of soul searching. And of course, Jung discovered this because as a psychologist, dealing with some of the most repressed of his clients, after they even had maybe even the first one or two breakthroughs, they're painting mandalas, don't you know? Suddenly they're master artists, and the first stages of this. So of course one has to be optimistic. And secondly, because I have a personal private belief that evil has within it the seeds of its own destruction. It may have all the boogeyman, aspects to make you think it's also wonderfully powerful and everything. But then, like in some sort of Doctor Who crazy Twilight Zone thing, the big shadow becomes this little tiny baby or kid, this little ant walking about. Which in the Sufi tradition, they say, can just be dusted off when you find out what it is. It's the big shadow, the big ego, can be put in its place in no time at all.
Yes, it's when your self is right, the world matches that or mirrors that. Everything
It does, in fact, very much so, very much so.
So,
Yeah.
this is the root of the problem, isn't it? It's because we have this false self. This is the root of the
Yeah.
problem.
And that's based on the approval of other people. So nobody can say that what we're talking about is some vague, indefinable thing. If you are a victim of the approval of other people, you have what is known as a social ego, and therefore no selfhood. You have an illusion of selfhood, as I said, an idea of reality, but that's why you have all the issues and problems that you have in your life. And that's why you end up feeling like Victor Bloody Meldrew, where your whole life is one misery from morning to night. Yeah, you're making it that because your whole way of interacting in the world is boredom personified, limited, closed off, reductionist, based on science, based on certainties. Whoever gave you the idea that religion, and whoever told you to believe in these things, we do it because we're scared of reality. We're scared of selfhood. It's a tremendous... So if there's anything in the way of man in the selfhood, it's just his fear of that selfhood, his fear of diving in. It's very much like a child learning how to swim. There is really much, your jelly, your legs go to jelly. Of course, you're going to think it's marvelous. It's the greatest thing afterwards when you're floating about and flopping about in the water there. Why wasn't it doing this before, like?
It's that initial fear that prevents people from going over, and maybe the transitional phase.
Yeah.
And once you're there, everything is taken care of.
Right.
And people on that level are protected.
And it's the same thing in these subjects we've been talking about, except for the fact that we have an entire cult of disinformation also that is inserted, a whole fear mechanism through thousands of years that has created a permanent liman between conscious and unconscious. In other words, Krishnamurti, J. Krishnamurti, never, ever even used the word consciousness, and by the way, neither did Heidegger. Because he would say, why are you already dividing one part of consciousness from the other? Don't you see that that is already a problem? And he meant even the psychologists. He would say, even by a psychologist trying to say we have a conscious, a pre-conscious, and a subconscious, he already had a problem with that. It's all consciousness, except that the lighthouse, the keeper, right? And I described it on Henrik's show as the little doorman in his blue uniform at night with his torch, He's the keeper of the skyscraper of the corporation, fiddling about, checking your ID, thinking he's the lord of the whole corporation just because at night he's the caretaker. Well, he is in one way. He decides what lights are going on and off. Because the ego and the Mysterium are in charge of the lighthouse, they direct the light to this highly focused area that we've learned to call, because this is what we are, the ego. If that light was in the hands of someone else and you pulled it back, which is very much what the artists and poets have, they have this more diffuse light, you'd see that this is just one big continent. It's all consciousness. It's another illusion in a way to divide it. And shamanic people are not into that. They're not into that heavy thing about dividing. In fact, to the point where they don't even have a distinction at all between external reality, meaning physical reality, and psychic reality. This is a very important part of this, is microcosm and macrocosm are made out of the same stuff. But don't put even a word on that. Oh, you're talking about that's all mind then? No, again, you're repeating the problem, you know. Now, see, when the individual habitually does not accept these things, there's a price to pay. You see, there is this other level of existence, and it has its own workings, it has its own ordinances. And when it notices that all men, all women are living in forgetfulness, running into everything else that they could possibly imagine in order to hide in the light from this essence, excuse me, not essence, but noumena, what we're seeing, if you pull back from the canvas and now look at what's happening in society, you're now seeing the noumena doing its thing. The being unto death and the emptying oneself into nothingness that's required on an individual level is not being done. So what has happened? It's moved up the fractal, and now the disenchantment, the disenfranchisement, and the sort of Dionysian melting pot that's happening in our societies today, where nobody knows if they're coming and going, is that same action of deconstruction. I refuse to call it destruction. It's actually a deconstructive thing that's happening throughout the world. The Maya are referring to it as the age of revealing. The countdown to 2012, a lot of these other things are involved in this, which is what we presented in Architects of Control. The idea being that what you do not do, your character is your fate. Right? Jung, it'll appear in front of you. Freud, what you oppress will appear in front of you. It's a very, very well-known fact. Well-known theories. What is happening now on the social level is that this deconstructive untying, loosening, is taking place. Because people have been so rigid and they won't give it up of their own, so now there is a meltdown, economically, socially, and so on. I've always referred to the fact that even the language that Gore has used, he spoke on this in many interviews in the last lot of years, the very language that he uses for global warming is actually subtextual for psychological warming. This is why he also attracts a lot of followers, is because actually beneath all that meteorological mumbo-jumbo is a very interesting occult subtextual language, which Peter Taylor briefly also addressed in the fact that he's using the word carbon, but it really means death. Because carbon pulls you down, right? It reminds you of your mortality. Well, this goes on in the lives of all these architects of control, but in society, what you never understand anything that comes on TV or anything that's happening in society from now on, unless you're very aware of these psychological principles and dimensions we've been addressing, because everything will be talking to that. That logo, that motto that I showed on stage, I am what I am because of everyone, that would make Patrick McGowan chuck, right, is absolutely this. And it's in your face in plain view now. That's what they're doing. They know that man is disassociating and falling apart, so their little collective vibe and their mantra is going to increase all the more to galvanize and hold together the body politic, which is literally crumbling at the seams. Man has not been doing his homework. He has been negligent. He has been living in avoidance. So the addictions and the pharmaceutical industries and the new religion, which we see sprouting up in America, the new evangelism, all of this can be understood with what I'm talking about. It's trying to galvanize the ungalvanized. It goes back to asking the misguided for your guidance. Because you won't turn to your selfhood. You won't turn to the divination arts. You refuse to turn to nature. And so you're asking unguided, unfounded, unsolid, unsound, existentially vagrant people for your guidance. Yeah, that'll really get you somewhere, right? So what is happening now, and we can end on this, is that in society, you are seeing the mass movement of this interplay, psychic interplay. Because as we said, there's no real ultimate difference between what happens physically and what happens psychically. Therefore, there's another thing to be optimistic about. If you understand this and start to realize I now must take responsibility, I must identify my selfhood. I must discover what this is. And it's very easy. This is very grassroots, and there's very simple ways to do it. And for all you know, it may just be reading Heidegger or Colin Wilson or listening to music or picking up, getting a bit more serious, getting more intrigued in these subjects. I've tried to do that by presenting my work on websites and books, so in interviews, so that people can, at least even topically get their minds around this. Because that is the ultimate solution. Selfhood is internal. It can't be given to you, bestowed to you, directed by anyone else but yourself. You are your own shaman, you're your own priest and priestess, you're your own teacher. It doesn't mean you dispense with other teachers, but you understand that it's the teaching that is important. And also you must understand that you are merely a custodian of the teaching. You can't piss on it. It's not a lamppost. It's not going to be territorialized by you. It's holy ground. And if it passes through your psyche, you are its keeper, temporarily. There is no Archimedean point, and you will be tested thoroughly, because only the pure can love, and only the pure can know. In ancient traditions, they made sure. You read the Finn cycle, the Fenian cycle of Irish mythology, and the trials that the heroes were put through. You read the Arthurian cycle. You go to India, you look at the Zen, even in Africa, in South America, the enormous rituals and rites and trials that the neophyte was put through. Hey man, we got it easy today. We've got it easy. But just because, like I said, you don't have to work over burning coals and fight minotaurs, don't for an instant think that the trials have gone away. They're still there. They're just shifted a bit. But they'll still be there to test your ass to make sure that you're pure. Because this gnosis, this knowledge, is not going to be available to the filthy myths of the impure and the toxic. And as I said, they will rather go psychically deranged than approach this, because this is guarded as well. And so when you're looking at society today, realize that it's not a bunch of egalitarian, potluck, free-for-all, mumbo-jumbo. Oh, it's not available to everyone. There's only a certain caliber of person who's done their inner work, who is even going to even be in hope of approaching this information. And so when you see it being sold on TV programs and movies and spinner racks, as is wont to do, when it becomes trendy, be also aware of that. That is again this faux version, the smokescreen version, to help galvanize you. Because of course, if you don't clean something, you can always do a spring clean, right? You can clean off the surface rust. And so every decade or so, Big Brother puts stuff out there to do the spring cleaning, to give the sheen, to give the appearance of health and sovereignty. But that's because it doesn't want the real thing to sink in. What we're seeing now is the preparation of the soil so that the real rooting can take place. But as I've said a million times in the Disciples of Mysterium article and in almost all my work, you cannot have the chemical wedding, and even the alchemists forgot to tell you this, by the way. You can't have the chemical wedding without first experiencing what's known as a chemical divorce. Unless, as Krishnamurti said, until the false is seen as false, you will never see the true. It's also deconstructive, it's catabolic, and it's what's called apophatic. You must see the lie as the lie, you must see the false as the false, and only then may the truth avail itself. But you're never going to be able to see the truth directly, through an act of will.
That's very positive if you think about how many people are waking up to the false at the moment.
Yes. Well, this is what I'm addressing. They have to realize one very, very important point. It's extremely important. In Carl Jung and Freud's theories of man's ego relationship to his unconscious, and Jung brought it out more than Freud. And this has to be really, really deeply understood. The unconscious is specular. Specular means of mirror, lens-like, mirror-like. Whatever visage you turn upon the unconscious, it reflects back. Quantum scientists will get on this right away because they go, oh, that's what the quantum universe does. Well, the quantum universe is your unconscious, by the way, but without even talking about that. Whatever face you shine into the unconscious, it shines back. If you shine a face of hostility, fear, trepidation, false curiosity, need for power, greed, intrigue, whatever, you'll meet demons. So the way is already you. There is no path per se. You make the path as you go. The path opens up in front of you as you walk. But the path is nightmare or dream, sorcery or magic, based on your profile as you walk through that noumena. It's not there already. It is created as you move through it in a way that almost Jean Cocteau in one of his phenomenal movies would show you as they walk through the mirror. Orphe is guiding. And they walk into the underworld. It's made as you project it out. The man who shows, like Blake, a fearless I don't want to use the word loving because it's so hideously, misinterpreted. A caring, fearless, sovereign face to that form. He has his other reality. He's not looking for utopia built by Big Brother because he has one in the living moment of now. One that's ever-changing, kaleidoscopic, mutable, and ever-changing, and ever-explorative. Renewing itself endlessly, right? And changing as he changes. It's an inner landscape that is more real than anything Big Brother with its bricks and mortar can ever hope to conceive, populated by a bunch of non-entities, right? So this is as I said, provide the opposite, Michael. Come on, you keep bashing everything. Yes, create your own world, create your own landscape. As you said about the prisoner, different values.
Yes,
right?
Exactly.
Not your values,
yes.
Right? Change your way of doing things, and cultivate your own organic intelligence, which, by the way, your children are the teacher if you'd let them speak, but you don't. They already have it until you burn it down. So, but it's there again in the mental topographies of various artists and so on. And I'm not saying just become disciples of them. I'm saying use them as a model to become that type of individual yourself. Bond with animals, bond with the inanimate. My big thing is, when I really do my solution thing on this, is utterly a theory of the inanimate, so-called. It doesn't even really involve human beings because there's too much problems there. My thing is an introduction to people to get in touch with the inanimate around them, starting with the room, the clothes they wear, and the light, and the window panes, and that whole existential examination of the so-called inanimate around us. But never forgetting for a moment that you make your own reality, because there's no such thing as an objective reality. We could have gone deeper into this with Heidegger's theories, but it would be too long-winded. The idea is this: whatever face you shine onto any mystery, be it external reality, another person, or your own unconscious, is what it becomes. That's where the choice mechanism is. If you shine the face of fear and want and emptiness and lack, right, or greed or envy, you will be met by demons. If you shine this other face of sovereignty and empowerment and stability, you will have another reality open up. And if you don't want to have that rapport, there is no other road for you but schizophrenia and social deremption. It's impossible. Knowing that, Big Brother has come along with a lot of catchphrases about oneness. Like I said, they've created the smokescreen to hold and galvanize everybody, and one of them is just the very term, oneness, which I've addressed in the Mysterium article as being completely hypothetical. There's no such thing as oneness anywhere to be found in the universe or the world. But this is a catchphrase, it's a talismanic word. And I finished with this. People can visualize this. A pile of broken shards can be considered a oneness. The oneness that is spoken about in Global Village vernacular is nothing but the oneness of a bunch of ghostly, spectral, unsound, unwhole selves coming together in a big papier-mâché mess. And we've got oneness now. A bunch of broken souls. Lefties, righties, uppers, downers, freaks, gooks, whatever you want to call them. All the world's people, all the shards and broken souls, clinging and galvanizing in some hideous Quatermass, Blake 7, ultra world, devouring brain, being eaten and giving, literally it's a form of self-sacrifice. You're now entering into Ayn Rand's worst nightmare, right? Where all the broken cells compensate by becoming one big, massive, amorphous, ultra-world brain. And now we've got our oneness and our wholeness. The allness, we don't even use the word oneness. The mystics and the teachers, their allness, or you might want to use the term wholeness, can only be achieved, and this is quite logical, when everyone is themselves a holon, and then maybe later if other holons come together, you have the true hologram, the true holograph, in which the whole is in the small, and the larger, right, in a single drop of rain, the whole topography is encapsulated, isn't it? And as you know, in fractal, the fractal contains the all. So all the oneness that you're hearing about today is only the wholeness of broken souls, broken, death, self-murdered people. So it's livid, it's morbid, it's filth. The wholeness that is real is an allness, which does exist, but it is predicated upon each individual being a complete totality coming together, right? And that can't happen until there's a unification between the ego and the unconscious. And the study of that takes you into the realms of psychology, right, as opposed to politics and other things. And that's why, my message has now become very much that, blending the world of psychology and various aspects of existential philosophy. That's the raison d'etre of the work that I'm doing now and also in the future. We're doing a DVD. It'll be out in April, called Disciples of Mysterium. Right now, no, it's a Michael Tsarion film. It's part of 3 or 4 projects, including Architects of Control, that's being done. Trees of Life, Disciples of the Mysterium, and various. We're always working on various projects. But actually, the Disciples of Mysterium is now in text form on the Michael Tsarion website. People just click on Next. They'll see a few articles there, and one of them is that, so they can go there, and read it. There's so many other things, that we didn't have time to get into. There's also an interview on Red Eyes Creations, that goes into this as part of a 3-part series, getting into consciousness. In fact, I think those are almost like the first. I would go so far as to say, in that particular context, these are one-of-a-kind interviews in which we fuse conspiracy and psychology together in a way that's never been done before. So we're very proud of those and proud of this work. So people can just go to the Michael Tsarion website or the forum, and read the text. And by April of 2010, we'll actually have the DVD for people as well on Disciples of the Mysterium.